Elise Bennett had always been a woman of control. At 43, she had meticulously crafted the perfect life, a life many envied. Her career as a director at a prestigious marketing firm in New York had seen meteoric success. She was the epitome of elegance, tall, slender, with sharp features that mirrored the precision with which she lived her life. Her poise, confidence, and intellect made her stand out in any room she entered. Elise had everything that should have made her happy: a flourishing career, a supportive husband, 2 beautiful children, and a house that spoke of her accomplishments. But under the facade of perfection, she was drowning. Elise's husband, Mark, a successful attorney, adored her. Their marriage was stable, functional, and respectful, but it had lost its passion years ago. Mark was a kind man, but they lived like roommates rather than lovers. Their conversations revolved around children, finances, and the occasional shared social event. The excitement, the thrill of living life had long vanished. Elise missed the spark, the unpredictability of love. But she buried these thoughts deep inside, masking them with her well-maintained exterior. As Elise drove home one late summer evening, the city lights casting a soft glow through the car windows, she couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. She was good at her job. No, she was great at it. People admired her for her leadership and ability to handle any crisis that came her way. But in her heart, she knew something was missing. She had lived her life making others proud, but where was the joy, the thrill, the fire? Was this all her life was meant to be? Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Jenna, her best friend, a lawyer who worked at Mark's firm. "Elise, dinner on Saturday, don't forget," Jenna chirped cheerfully through the line. "Of course, I'll be there. Is Mark coming?" Elise asked, already knowing the answer. Mark's career consumed most of his time, and lately he had been working late nights with no end in sight. "He said he'd try, but you know him, probably tied up with another case," Jenna replied, her tone slightly sympathetic, though the gesture was empty. "I'll see you then. Thanks for the reminder." As she ended the call, Elise parked her car in front of her home, a modern, minimalist architectural gem that reflected the pristine life she had built. But as she stared at its glass windows, she felt the coldness seep into her soul. Inside, the children were asleep, and Mark was in his office, engrossed in his laptop. Elise silently made her way to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of wine. Standing by the window, she gazed out into the night, her thoughts spiraling back to the gnawing question: what was she doing with her life? She had everything, yet it felt like nothing. The next morning, Elise's routine continued like clockwork. She kissed the kids goodbye, exchanged a quick nod with Mark as he headed out early for court, and drove to work. It was just another day in the seemingly perfect life of Elise Bennett. That was until she met him. In the bustling chaos of New York, her company was preparing for the launch of a new marketing campaign. Elise had been sent a courier to deliver some urgent documents. Nothing out of the ordinary, until the young man entered her office. He couldn't have been older than 20. Tall, with tousled dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead, and a pair of deep, intelligent eyes that looked like they had seen much more than his years should have allowed. He was thin, with an air of quiet intensity about him, something mysterious and reserved. "Miss Bennett?" he asked, his voice soft but carrying a weight that caught Elise's attention. "Yes, that's me," she responded, looking up from her computer. He handed her the documents, and for a moment, their eyes locked. Something shifted in the air. Elise didn't know what it was, but she felt it, like an electric current passing through her. There was something about this young man, something unexplainable, that tugged at a part of her she had long suppressed. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than usual. He nodded, a polite smile on his lips before turning to leave. "What's your name?" Elise found herself asking, surprising even herself. He paused, slightly turning his head. "Lucas. Lucas Moreau," he replied. "Thank you, Lucas." And then he was gone. Elise sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Why had she felt the need to ask his name? It wasn't something she normally did, but there was something about him. Something in the way he moved, the way his eyes held a quiet storm within them, that intrigued her. That evening, as Elise sat in her living room, wine in hand, she couldn't shake the image of Lucas from her mind. She had met countless people in her career. Charming men, powerful executives, charismatic colleagues. But Lucas was different. There was a depth to him, a rawness that Elise found herself drawn to. The days passed, and Elise tried to push the memory of Lucas aside. But fate had other plans. A week later, she saw him again. This time, outside a music shop as she walked through the city. He was sitting on a bench, his head bent over a sheet of music, his fingers moving in the air as though playing an invisible piano. Elise stopped, watching him from a distance. There was a serenity about him, a sense of being completely absorbed in the moment. She couldn't help herself. She approached him. "You play?" she asked, her voice soft. Lucas looked up, surprised to see her. "Yeah, I do," he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Do you mind if I listen?" He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He took out a small keyboard from his courier bag and began to play. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, a mix of melancholy and passion that stirred something deep within Elise. As the notes flowed from his fingers, Elise felt as if the world around them had faded away, leaving only the music and the two of them. For the first time in a long while, she felt alive. When Lucas finished, there was a long silence between them. Finally, Elise spoke. That was breathtaking. "Thank you," Lucas replied, his eyes meeting hers. There was a vulnerability in them, a quiet intensity that made Elise's heart race. In that moment, something shifted inside her. She didn't know where this was going, but she knew one thing. She wasn't ready to walk away from Lucas just yet. Elise had always believed in control. Control over her life, her decisions, and especially her emotions. But Lucas Moreau had disrupted that balance. Over the following weeks, her thoughts became increasingly tangled with his presence. She would find herself thinking about him during mundane tasks, her mind wandering to the haunting melody he had played on that small keyboard in the park. It was as though his music had unlocked something deep within her, a part of her she had long forgotten. Despite her best efforts to focus on work and her responsibilities, Elise couldn't stop herself from thinking about Lucas. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself that it was just a passing fascination, nothing more. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. One evening, a week after their chance meeting outside the music shop, Elise found herself sitting at her desk, staring blankly at her computer screen. The house was quiet. The children were with a babysitter, and Mark was working late again. The stillness around her felt suffocating, and for reasons she couldn't fully comprehend, she picked up her phone and sent Lucas a message. "Would you like to meet for coffee?" she typed, her heart pounding as she hit send. The reply came almost immediately. "Sure. When and where?" Elise gave him the address of a small cafe she frequented, one tucked away in a quiet corner of the city where no one would recognize her. As she sat there waiting for Lucas to arrive, her mind raced with questions. What was she doing? Why was she taking this risk? But there was no denying the excitement she felt, the rush of adrenaline that came with the unknown. Lucas arrived a few minutes later, dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans. He looked every bit the young, carefree artist, a stark contrast to the polished, professional men Elise was accustomed to dealing with. "Hi," he said, smiling as he sat down across from her. "Hi," Elise replied, her voice a little softer than usual. She couldn't quite shake the feeling that she was stepping into dangerous territory, but at the same time, she didn't want to turn back. They made small talk at first, discussing music, work, and life in the city. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken tension between them, an energy that neither of them could ignore. "So do you always invite your couriers for coffee?" Lucas asked, a teasing smile on his lips. Elise laughed, though her heart was pounding. "No, you're the first." "I'm honored," Lucas said, his tone softening. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment the world around them seemed to blur. "I have to admit, I wasn't expecting this." "Neither was I," Elise confessed. She paused, searching for the right words. "There's something about you, Lucas. Something I can't quite explain." Lucas didn't reply immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You don't seem like the type to get involved in anything messy," he said, his voice low. Elise smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm not. Or at least, I didn't used to be." There was a long pause between them, filled only by the quiet hum of the cafe and the occasional clink of dishes. Finally, Lucas spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me, Elise?" It was a question that took her by surprise. What did she want from him? She wasn't entirely sure herself. All she knew was that Lucas represented something she had been missing for a long time, something raw, passionate, and real. "I don't know," she admitted. I need to feel something again." Lucas didn't press her for more. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers. The touch was light, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her body. It was the first physical connection they had shared, and it was enough to shatter any remaining sense of control Elise had. That night marked the beginning of something that neither Elise nor Lucas could fully grasp. They began to see each other more frequently, always in secret, always careful not to let their worlds collide. Elise found herself making excuses to leave the office early or to work late, all to steal moments with Lucas. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. When she was with him, the world seemed brighter, more vivid. Lucas, on the other hand, was a mystery. He lived in a small, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, where he spent most of his time composing music. Despite his rough exterior and humble upbringing, he was incredibly talented. His compositions were filled with emotion, with a depth that far surpassed his age. Elise often found herself mesmerized by his music, losing track of time as she listened to him play. But for all their passion, there was a growing tension between them. Elise knew that what they were doing was dangerous, that it could ruin everything she had worked so hard to build. But the more time she spent with Lucas, the harder it became to walk away. One night, as they lay together in Lucas's apartment, the dim light from the street outside casting shadows across the room, Elise turned to him. "Do you ever wonder what we're doing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of emotions she couldn't quite read. "All the time," he admitted. "But I don't want to stop." Elise sighed, resting her head against his chest. "Neither do I, but we can't keep doing this forever." "I know," Lucas said quietly, "but for now, can't we just enjoy it?" Elise closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. She knew he was right. For now, they could pretend that this was enough, that they could keep their affair hidden in the shadows. But deep down, Elise knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. As the weeks passed, Elise found it increasingly difficult to maintain the balance between her two worlds. Her relationship with Mark grew more strained, and though he didn't seem to suspect anything, Elise could feel the distance between them widening. She had become an expert at hiding her emotions, but even she couldn't ignore the cracks that were beginning to form. One evening, as she sat in her office after hours, her phone buzzed with a message from Lucas. "Come over, I have something to show you." Without thinking, Elise grabbed her coat and headed for the door. She didn't know what Lucas had in store, but she couldn't resist the pull he had on her. When she arrived at his apartment, she found him sitting at his keyboard, a look of concentration on his face. "I've been working on something," he said, his voice soft as she entered the room. Elise sat down beside him, watching as his fingers moved over the keys. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with a sense of longing and passion that made her heart ache. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Lucas turned to her, his eyes filled with an intensity that made her breath catch. "It's for you." Elise's heart raced as the weight of his words sank in. She had never imagined that someone like Lucas, young, brilliant, and full of life, could feel so deeply for her. And yet, here he was, pouring his soul into the music he had written for her. For the first time in a long while, Elise felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had spent so many years building walls around her heart, protecting herself from the vulnerability of love. But with Lucas, those walls were crumbling, and that terrified her. Elise woke up the next morning in Lucas's apartment, the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains. She lay there for a moment, watching the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. For the first time in years, she felt free. But that freedom was laced with an undercurrent of dread. What she was doing with Lucas wasn't sustainable, and as much as she tried to push the thought away, it loomed over her like a storm cloud. She gently slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and dressed quietly. Her phone vibrated on the kitchen counter, a reminder that her real life awaited her. She glanced at the screen, 3 missed calls from Mark. Guilt gnawed at her as she left Lucas's apartment, her heart heavy with the knowledge of her betrayal. She had no idea how long she could continue living this double life, but the thought of giving Lucas up was unbearable. Back home, Elise's world continued to function like a well-oiled machine. She was the perfect wife, the loving mother, the capable director at work. Mark didn't seem to notice the growing emotional distance between them, or maybe he was too distracted by his own career to care. Either way, Elise was grateful for the illusion of normalcy, though it felt more fragile with each passing day. That evening, as she prepared dinner for the family, Mark came up behind her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Busy day?" he asked, his tone casual. Elise tensed, the weight of her secret pressing down on her. "Yeah, the usual," she replied, forcing a smile. Mark nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer, and went back to the living room to check on the kids. Elise watched him go, her heart heavy with the realization that, despite their years together, Mark no longer really knew her. Perhaps he never had. Days turned into weeks, and Elise's affair with Lucas continued to intensify. They stole moments whenever they could, their meetings growing more reckless and passionate. But as their relationship deepened, so did the complexity of Elise's emotions. Lucas was no longer just an escape from her mundane life. He had become a vital part of her existence. She couldn't imagine going back to the way things were before she met him. With Lucas, she felt alive in a way she hadn't for years. But with that vitality came a growing sense of fear. She knew they were walking a dangerous line, one that could easily shatter the lives they were trying so desperately to protect. One afternoon, as Elise sat in her office, her assistant knocked on the door. "Miss Bennett, you have a visitor." Elise looked up, her heart skipping a beat. It was Lucas. He walked into her office, a casual confidence about him that both excited and unnerved her. They had been careful up until now, always meeting in secret places where they wouldn't be recognized. But here he was, in her professional world, a place where their lives should never intersect. "Elise," he said, his voice low as he closed the door behind him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Panic flickered in her chest, though she tried to keep her expression calm. "I needed to see you," Lucas said, stepping closer. His eyes searched hers, and for a moment, all her concerns faded in the intensity of his gaze. But Elise quickly regained control of her emotions. "Lucas, you can't be here," she whispered, glancing toward the door as if someone might walk in at any moment. "I know," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But I can't keep doing this, Elise. Hiding, sneaking around. It's driving me crazy." Elise's heart sank. She had known this moment would come, the point where the weight of their affair would become too much to bear. But she wasn't ready to face it. "What are you saying?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Lucas hesitated for a moment, his jaw tense. "I'm saying I don't want to be your secret anymore. I want more. I want all of you." Elise felt a lump form in her throat. She had known Lucas cared for her, but she hadn't expected this. She wasn't sure what she had expected, really. Maybe that they could continue this secret life forever without consequence. But Lucas was young, and he was right. He deserved more than stolen moments in the dark. "Lucas," she began, struggling to find the words. "You know I can't give you that. My life, it's complicated. I have a family. I have a career. I can't just walk away from all of it." Lucas looked at her, pain flashing in his eyes. "I know, but I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending this is enough for me." Elise's heart ached at the sadness in his voice. She wanted to give him what he wanted, but she couldn't. She had built her entire life on stability, on control, and the idea of throwing it all away for Lucas, no matter how much she cared for him, terrified her. "I wish things were different," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "But I can't change who I am, Lucas." He stood there for a moment, staring at her, his expression a mixture of frustration and heartbreak. Then, without another word, he turned and left the office, leaving Elise standing there, her heart shattered into pieces. The following days were a blur for Elise. She threw herself into her work, trying to ignore the gaping hole Lucas had left in her life. She avoided his calls and messages, knowing that speaking to him would only make things harder. But every time her phone buzzed, her heart skipped a beat, wondering if it was him. It wasn't until one late afternoon, as she was packing up to leave the office, that her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Lucas. It was Mark. "Dinner tonight?" the message read. Elise stared at the screen, her mind reeling. She had spent so long hiding her affair from Mark that she hadn't realized how disconnected they had become. Her relationship with Lucas had taken up so much emotional space that there was barely anything left for her marriage. And yet, here was Mark, oblivious to it all, still reaching out in his own way. Guilt surged through her. She couldn't keep living like this, torn between two worlds, constantly lying to herself and everyone around her. Something had to change. That night, as she sat across from Mark at a quiet restaurant downtown, Elise felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her like never before. She had been so focused on her own desires, her own needs, that she had lost sight of everything else. But now, faced with the man she had once loved, she felt the full gravity of what she had done. "How's work?" Mark asked, his tone casual as he sipped his wine. Elise hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "Busy," she finally said. "Same as always." Mark nodded, but there was a tension in his eyes that Elise hadn't noticed before. "You've been distant lately," he said, his voice softer now. "Is everything okay?" Elise's heart raced. She had always prided herself on being able to control her emotions, to keep her secrets hidden. But now, under Mark's gaze, she felt exposed, vulnerable. She started, then stopped, unsure of what to say. She could tell him the truth, about Lucas, about everything. But what would that accomplish? It would only destroy the life they had built together. And for what? A fleeting affair with a young man who could never truly fit into her world? Elise took a deep breath, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, Mark. Just tired. It's been a lot of pressure at work lately." Mark studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing, but then he nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "All right," he said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Just know that I'm here, if you ever need to talk." Elise smiled, though the gesture felt hollow. "I know. Thank you." But even as she said the words, a part of her knew that things were far from fine. She was standing on the edge of a precipice, and sooner or later, everything was going to come crashing down. Elise returned home that night, her head spinning with the weight of her conversation with Mark. She had managed to hold it together during dinner, but inside, she felt like she was coming apart at the seams. The life she had so carefully constructed, her marriage, her career, her affair, was on the verge of collapse, and for the first time, she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the charade. As she lay in bed that night, Mark sleeping soundly beside her, Elise's thoughts drifted to Lucas. She missed him, the way his eyes lit up when he played the piano, the way he made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. But she couldn't ignore the truth. Their affair was a ticking time bomb, and sooner or later, it would explode. She thought about what Lucas had said, about not wanting to be her secret anymore. She understood his frustration. He was young, full of passion and potential, while she was trapped in a life of obligation and responsibility. He deserved more than stolen moments in dark corners, but she couldn't give him what he wanted. She couldn't walk away from her life, no matter how suffocating it felt at times. Elise stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. She knew she had to make a decision soon. Either she ended things with Lucas and returned to the safety of her marriage, or she risked everything for a love that might never last. But the thought of losing Lucas was unbearable. The next few days were a blur of work and family obligations. Elise buried herself in meetings, presentations, and deadlines, trying to push Lucas from her mind. She spent more time with her children, making an effort to reconnect with them, as if somehow that would ease the growing sense of guilt that gnawed at her. But no matter how hard she tried, Lucas lingered in her thoughts like a ghost, haunting her every move. One afternoon, as she was leaving the office, her phone buzzed with a message from Lucas. "I miss you." 3 simple words that made her heart ache. She had been avoiding him for days, trying to create some distance between them, but it was no use. She couldn't stay away from him, no matter how much she knew she should. "I miss you too," she replied, her fingers trembling as she typed the words. His response came almost immediately. "Come over tonight?" Elise hesitated. She knew what going to see him meant, another step deeper into the labyrinth of lies she had created. But the pull of him was too strong, and before she could stop herself, she sent the reply. "I'll be there." That evening, Elise drove to Lucas's apartment, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was a bad idea, that every time she saw him, she was digging herself deeper into a hole she might never be able to climb out of. But she couldn't resist him. He was like a drug, and she was hopelessly addicted. When she arrived, Lucas was waiting for her, a soft smile on his lips that made her heart flutter. He pulled her into his arms, and for a moment, all the chaos in her life melted away. "I thought you were done with me," Lucas murmured against her hair, his voice laced with a vulnerability that caught Elise off guard. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her throat tight. I needed time to think." Lucas pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. "And? Have you decided?" Elise looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know, Lucas. I don't know what to do." Lucas's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might pull away from her, but instead he took her hand and led her to the couch. "Let's not talk about it tonight," he said softly. "Let's just be here, together." Elise nodded, grateful for the reprieve. She didn't want to think about the future, about the consequences of their affair. She just wanted to be with him, to lose herself in the safety of his arms, if only for a little while. The next morning, as Elise lay in bed beside Lucas, she knew that their time together was running out. They couldn't keep doing this, sneaking around and pretending that their affair had no impact on the rest of their lives. Sooner or later, someone would find out, and when that happened, everything would come crashing down. Lucas stirred beside her, his arm draped across her waist. "You're thinking too much," he said, his voice thick with sleep. Elise smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I can't help it." He propped himself up on one elbow, his expression serious. "You're worried about us." "I'm worried about everything," Elise admitted. "About Mark, about the kids, about what happens if this all falls apart." Lucas's eyes softened. "I don't want to hurt you, Elise, but I also don't want to lose you." Her heart clenched at his words. She knew he meant them, but the reality of their situation was inescapable. They were walking on a tightrope, and the ground was crumbling beneath their feet. "I don't want to lose you either," Elise whispered, her voice barely audible. Lucas leaned in and kissed her, his lips soft and full of longing. But even as she kissed him back, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of the end. A few days later, Elise's worst fear began to materialize. It started small. An innocent comment from one of her colleagues, noticing that she seemed distracted lately. Then there were the sideways glances from her assistant, as if she suspected something, but didn't dare say it out loud. Elise tried to brush it off, telling herself that she was being paranoid, but the unease only grew. And then, one evening, as she was preparing dinner for the family, Mark walked into the kitchen, his face grim. "Elise, we need to talk," he said, his voice tight. Elise's heart plummeted. She could tell by the tone of his voice that something was wrong, very wrong. "What is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Mark hesitated, his eyes dark with suspicion. "I got a call today, from Jenna." Elise's blood ran cold. Jenna, her best friend, the one person who knew her better than anyone else in the world. Had Jenna somehow found out about Lucas? Had she seen them together, or heard something? "She said she saw you with someone," Mark continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Elise's mind raced, panic surging through her veins. She tried to play it off, to act like nothing was wrong. "What are you talking about, Mark?" But Mark wasn't buying it. His eyes were hard, his jaw clenched. "Don't lie to me, Elise. Who is he?" Elise's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She had been so careful, so sure that no one would ever find out. But somehow, the truth had slipped through the cracks. She started, but Mark cut her off. "Is it true?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Are you seeing someone else?" Elise felt the walls closing in around her, her carefully constructed life crumbling at her feet. She had known this moment would come, but she had never imagined it would feel like this, like the ground was being ripped out from under her. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at her husband, the man she had once loved with all her heart. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Mark." Mark stared at her, his face pale with shock. For a moment, there was only silence between them, the weight of her confession hanging heavy in the air. And then, without another word, Mark turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Elise standing there, her world falling apart around her. The days that followed felt like a blur for Elise. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold and empty. Mark had moved into the guest bedroom, a silent reminder of the distance between them. He didn't say much. He barely looked at her, but his presence lingered like a shadow, a constant reminder of her betrayal. Elise found herself walking through her days in a haze, going through the motions of work, parenting, and life, but feeling like a stranger in her own skin. Every time she saw Mark, the guilt gnawed at her, deeper and sharper than before. She tried to reach out to him, to talk, but he always brushed her off, retreating into his silence. It was a painful dance, one where neither of them wanted to lead, but both were stuck in the rhythm of their shared misery. The children, sensing the tension, tiptoed around her, their innocent questions about Daddy's absence at the dinner table, or why Mommy seemed so sad, tearing at her heart. She wanted to shield them from the truth, but they were too perceptive, too attuned to the undercurrents in the house. It wasn't just her relationship with Mark that had shattered. Her affair with Lucas had come to an abrupt end, too. After receiving his message, Elise hadn't replied. What could she say? She had already destroyed too much, and clinging to Lucas as much as she wanted to would only make things worse. So she let him go. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Elise sat alone in the living room, nursing a glass of wine. She stared at the framed family photos on the mantel, the snapshots of happier times, vacations, birthdays, anniversaries. They felt like remnants of a life she no longer recognized. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, expecting it to be another work email or a message from one of the few friends she had confided in. But instead, it was Lucas. Are you okay? Elise's heart clenched at the simple message. It had been days since they last spoke, and she had thought that he, like everything else, was fading into the background of her broken life. But there he was, still reaching out, still concerned. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen, before finally replying. I don't know. The response felt raw, honest in a way she hadn't been with anyone else lately. She didn't know how she felt anymore, whether she was grieving the loss of her marriage, mourning the end of her affair, or simply lost in the mess of her own making. The reply came almost instantly. Do you want to talk? Elise stared at the words, conflicted. She missed Lucas, missed the way he made her feel alive, but she knew that reaching out to him now would only complicate things further. But there was a part of her, a small, selfish part, that craved the connection, the escape he had provided. I can't, she typed, her heart heavy. I need to figure things out first. There was a long pause before Lucas replied. I understand. Just know that I'm here if you need me. Elise put her phone down, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. She knew that Lucas would always hold a place in her heart, but for now, she had to focus on the wreckage in front of her. The next morning, Elise woke up to the sound of rain pattering against the windows. It was fitting, she thought, for the way her life felt, gray, dreary, and unrelenting. She made her way downstairs, the quiet of the house settling around her like a thick blanket. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, she heard the faint creak of footsteps behind her. Mark stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. It had been days since they'd had any meaningful conversation, and the tension between them was palpable. Morning, Elise said softly, unsure of how to break the silence. Morning, Mark replied, his voice flat. He walked past her, grabbing his own cup of coffee and leaning against the counter. For a moment, they stood in silence, the only sound the rain tapping against the windows. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice quiet but firm. We can't keep doing this, Elise. Elise's heart sank. She knew this conversation was coming, but hearing the words out loud made it real. I know, she whispered, her hands trembling as she set down her coffee cup. I don't know how to fix this, Mark. I don't even know if I can. Mark stared into his coffee, his brow furrowed in thought. I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything that's happened, and I don't know where to go from here. Elise swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling heavily on her chest. Do you want a divorce? Mark looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in days. There was pain there, but also something else, something softer, more conflicted. I don't know. Part of me does, but part of me still. He trailed off, his voice thick with emotion. I still love you, Elise. I hate what you did, but I can't just turn off the years we've spent together." Tears welled up in Elise's eyes. She hadn't expected that. She had prepared herself for anger, for bitterness, for the inevitable end of their marriage. But love? She didn't know how to respond to that. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never stopped loving you, Mark. I know I've made a mess of everything, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but She paused, struggling to find the words. "I want to try. I don't want to give up on us." Mark's expression softened, but the tension didn't leave his body. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Elise. What you did, it broke something in me. But I don't want to throw everything away without at least trying to fix it." Elise wiped at her eyes, her heart swelling with both hope and fear. "What do we do?" Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We go to counseling. We talk. We try to figure out where it all went wrong. But I can't promise that it'll work." "I understand," Elise said quietly. "I'll do whatever it takes, Mark. I'll fight for us." For the first time in days, Mark offered her a small, tentative smile. It wasn't much, but it was something, a glimmer of hope in the midst of the wreckage. Later that evening, after the children were in bed, Mark and Elise sat together on the couch, the silence between them more comfortable than it had been in weeks. They didn't talk much, but for the first time, there was a sense that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way through the mess they had created. As the rain continued to fall outside, Elise rested her head on Mark's shoulder, her heart heavy but hopeful. They had a long way to go, and there were no guarantees. But for the first time in a long time, she felt they were at least moving in the right direction. The silence in the house was suffocating. After Mark had walked out of the kitchen, Elise hadn't been able to move. She stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of what had just happened was almost too much to bear. She had known that her affair with Lucas would eventually come to light, but she hadn't expected it to happen like this. Mark's anger, his shock, it was more than she could have prepared for. Now, as the reality of her situation settled over her, Elise knew there was no going back. The life she had carefully constructed was in ruins, and the future was uncertain. Mark didn't come home that night. Elise lay awake in their bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of the front door opening, but it never came. The house felt eerily quiet without him there, and the emptiness only heightened her guilt. She had betrayed him, and now she was paying the price. But the guilt wasn't just for Mark, it was for her children too. They had no idea what was happening, no idea that their family was about to be torn apart. Elise's heart ached at the thought of them finding out, of having to explain why their father wasn't coming home. The next morning, Elise went through the motions of getting the kids ready for school. They were blissfully unaware of the tension in the air, of the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface. She kissed them goodbye and watched as they ran off to the bus stop, their laughter ringing in the crisp morning air. It felt like a cruel contrast to the chaos inside her. As soon as they were gone, Elise picked up her phone and dialed Mark's number. It rang several times before going to voicemail. "Mark, please, call me. We need to talk." She hung up, her hand trembling. She didn't know where he was, but she knew he needed time. Time to process, to come to terms with what she had done. But she was terrified of what would happen when he finally did. Later that day, Elise sat in her office, staring at her computer screen. She had come to work in an attempt to distract herself, but it was impossible to focus. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Mark, to the mess she had made of her life. She had spent years building a perfect facade, only to watch it crumble in a matter of moments. She picked up her phone and opened a message from Lucas that she had left unread. "I need to see you. Please, let's talk." Elise's heart clenched. Lucas didn't know what had happened. How could he? He was still waiting for her, still clinging to the hope that they could find a way to be together. But Elise wasn't sure that was possible anymore. Her affair with Lucas had cost her everything, and now she wasn't sure if she could continue seeing him, even if she wanted to. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was Mark. Her heart jumped into her throat as she answered. "Mark," she said, her voice shaking. There was a long pause on the other end before he finally spoke. "We need to talk." Elise nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I know. I'm so sorry, Mark. I never wanted. Meet me at the house after work, Mark interrupted, his voice cold and detached. We'll talk then. The call ended abruptly, leaving Elise staring at the phone in her hand, her stomach twisted in knots. She had no idea what Mark was going to say or how this conversation would go, but she knew it wasn't going to be easy. That evening, Elise arrived home to find Mark sitting in the living room, his face pale and drawn. He looked up when she entered, but there was no warmth in his eyes. The tension between them was palpable, like a thick fog that hung in the air, suffocating them both. Mark? Elise started, but he held up a hand, stopping her. Just let me talk, he said, his voice low and strained. I've been thinking about this all day, and I still don't know what to say. I thought we were happy. I thought we had everything. Elise's throat tightened, tears welling up in her eyes. We did. We do. I don't know what happened, Mark. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. Mark shook his head, a bitter smile on his lips. You didn't just hurt me, Elise. You destroyed everything. Our marriage, our family. How do we come back from this? Elise's heart shattered at his words. She wanted to tell him that they could fix it, that they could find a way to heal, but deep down she wasn't sure if that was true. The damage had been done, and no matter how much she wanted to undo it, she couldn't. I don't know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know if we can. Mark's expression hardened. Why, Elise? Why did you do it? Elise wiped at her eyes, struggling to find the words. I don't know. I felt lost. I felt like I was drowning in this life, and I didn't know how to fix it. Mark stared at her, his jaw clenched. And Lucas? Was he your way of fixing it? Elise winced at the mention of Lucas's name. She didn't want to drag him into this, but there was no avoiding it now. It wasn't about him, Mark. It was about me. I felt like I had lost myself, and he made me feel alive again. Mark laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and grating. Alive? Is that what this is about? You wanted to feel alive, so you threw away our marriage for some 20-year-old kid? Elise flinched, the weight of his words hitting her like a punch to the gut. It wasn't like that, Mark. I didn't plan for this to happen. It happened. Mark stood up, pacing the room as he ran a hand through his hair. I can't believe this, Elise. I thought we had something real. I thought we were building a life together. And now I don't even know who you are anymore. Elise felt the tears spill over, her chest tightening with the weight of her guilt. I'm still me, Mark. I made a terrible mistake, but I'm still the same person. I still love you. Mark stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes filled with pain. Do you? Because I don't know if I believe that anymore. Elise's heart broke at his words. She had never wanted to lose Mark, never wanted to hurt him like this. But now, standing in the wreckage of their marriage, she wasn't sure if there was anything left to save. What do we do now? She asked, her voice trembling. Mark sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. I don't know, Elise. I don't know if I can forgive you for this. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Elise had feared this moment for so long, but now that it was here, it felt surreal. She had always imagined that there would be a way to fix things, a way to make everything right again. But standing in front of Mark now, she realized that some things couldn't be fixed. I understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry, Mark. Mark didn't say anything else. He just stood there, staring at her, his expression filled with a sadness that cut Elise to the core. After a long, painful silence, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there alone. For the next few days, Elise felt like she was living in a daze. Mark hadn't spoken to her since their conversation, and the distance between them felt insurmountable. She tried to go about her daily routine, but everything felt hollow and meaningless. Her children noticed the change, though they didn't understand it. They asked why Daddy wasn't around as much, why Mommy seemed so sad, but Elise didn't have the heart to tell them the truth. And then, one evening, as she sat alone in the living room, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Lucas. I can't do this anymore. Elise stared at the words on the screen, her heart sinking. She had known this moment would come, that Lucas would eventually realize that their affair was unsustainable. But knowing it didn't make it any easier. She wanted to respond, to tell him that she needed him, that she couldn't lose him too. But deep down, she knew that this was the right decision. Lucas had been a temporary escape, a way for her to feel something again. But now, with her marriage in shambles, she couldn't keep running from the consequences of her actions. Elise put the phone down, tears streaming down her face. She had lost everything: her husband, her lover, her sense of self. And now, all she could do was pick up the pieces and try to figure out where to go from here. The following weeks were a delicate dance between hope and heartache. Mark and Elise had agreed to start counseling, a small but significant step toward mending the fractures in their marriage. Elise wasn't naive. She knew the road ahead would be long and painful, but it was a road she was willing to take, no matter how difficult. Their first session with the therapist was awkward, to say the least. They sat in the dimly lit office, the silence between them heavy. Elise couldn't bring herself to look at Mark, her stomach twisting with guilt. It felt like the weight of her affair, her lies, were filling the room, suffocating her. The therapist, Dr. Avery, was a kind woman in her 50s with a calming presence. She had seen it all, and as Elise and Mark awkwardly explained their situation, she listened patiently, nodding occasionally, but never judging. Infidelity is one of the hardest things a marriage can face, Dr. Avery said softly after they had both spoken. But it's not insurmountable. The fact that you're both here shows that there's something worth fighting for. Mark shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. Elise could see the tension in his body, the way his hands rested tightly on his knees, as if he were holding himself back from saying something harsh. She wished she could reach out to him, tell him she was sorry again, but she knew it wouldn't help. He needed time. Dr. Avery looked between them, her gaze soft but direct. Before we talk about forgiveness, we need to talk about trust. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, and right now, that foundation has been shaken. We need to rebuild it, brick by brick. Mark let out a slow breath, his eyes fixed on the floor. I don't know how to trust her again, he admitted, his voice low. Every time I look at her, all I see is what she did, what she took from us. Elise's heart broke at his words, but she forced herself to stay silent. This was his pain, and he had every right to feel it, to express it. She knew that any attempt to defend herself would only deepen the wound. Dr. Avery nodded, her expression understanding. That's completely normal, Mark. Infidelity creates a deep wound, and it takes time to heal. Trust won't return overnight, and it's not something you can force. But with time, honesty, and openness, it can be rebuilt. Elise swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll do whatever it takes. I want to earn your trust again, Mark. I know I broke it, and I'm so sorry, but I want us to work. Mark didn't respond right away. He continued staring at the floor, his hands gripping his knees. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. But I want to try, for the kids, for us, for everything we've built. Elise nodded, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. It was a chance. The weeks that followed were filled with therapy sessions and painful conversations. Mark and Elise had to confront the reasons behind her affair, the cracks in their marriage that had gone unnoticed for too long. Elise was forced to admit that she had been lost, that she had used Lucas as an escape from the emptiness she felt inside. But she also had to face the fact that her actions had hurt not just Mark, but their entire family. Mark, for his part, opened up about his own struggles, the pressure of his career, the way he had buried himself in work to avoid dealing with the emotional distance between them. It wasn't an excuse, but it helped them both understand how they had drifted apart. Some nights were better than others. There were moments when they laughed together, fleeting glimpses of the connection they had once shared. But there were also nights when Mark couldn't look at her, when the pain was too fresh, too raw. Those nights were the hardest. Elise would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they were truly capable of rebuilding what they had lost. But despite the setbacks, they kept going. They showed up to therapy, they talked, they listened. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One afternoon, a few weeks into their counseling, Elise was sitting in the kitchen when she heard the front door open. Mark walked in, his shoulders slumped, his briefcase in hand. He looked exhausted, but when his eyes met hers, there was a softness there that she hadn't seen in a while. How was work? Elise asked, trying to keep her tone light. Mark shrugged, setting his briefcase down by the door. Same as usual. A lot of meetings, not enough time. Elise smiled faintly. Sounds familiar? Mark hesitated for a moment, then walked over to the kitchen table and sat down across from her. Listen, I've been thinking about us. Elise's heart skipped a beat. She had been dreading this conversation, but she knew it was inevitable. Okay, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark took a deep breath, his hands resting on the table between them. I've been angry for so long, Elise. Angry at you, angry at myself, angry at everything. But the truth is, I miss you. I miss us. Elise felt tears prick at her eyes. I miss us too, Mark. He nodded, his expression softening. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you yet. I don't know if I ever will be. But I'm tired of being angry. I'm tired of holding on to all this pain. I want to try to move forward, for us and for the kids. Elise's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and hope. She knew that forgiveness wouldn't come easily, but the fact that Mark was willing to try to move past the anger meant more than she could express. I want that too, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I'll do whatever it takes, Mark. I'll keep showing up. I'll keep fighting for us. Mark reached across the table and took her hand, his touch hesitant but warm. One step at a time, okay? Elise nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. One step at a time. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, things began to change. It wasn't a miraculous transformation. There were still moments of tension, still nights when the weight of the past hung heavy between them. But there were also moments of connection, moments when Elise felt like she and Mark were rediscovering each other after years of drifting apart. They spent more time together as a family, taking the kids to the park, playing board games in the living room, and laughing at old jokes that still held a spark of their former life. The children, sensing the shift, seemed happier, more relaxed. It was as if they had been holding their breath, waiting for their parents to find their way back to each other. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mark turned to Elise and smiled, a real, genuine smile. It was a small thing, but to Elise, it felt like the sun breaking through the clouds after a long storm. I think we're going to be okay, Mark said softly, his hand resting on hers. Elise leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. I hope so, she whispered, her heart full of gratitude for this second chance. They still had a long way to go, and Elise knew that the scars of her betrayal would never fully fade. But for the first time in a long time, she believed that they could heal, that they could rebuild what they had lost, one step at a time. The summer days stretched out long and golden, and with each passing week, the tension in Elise and Mark's home began to ease. It was as though the act of rebuilding their marriage had drawn a new energy into their lives. The therapy sessions, the open conversations, the quiet moments they now shared, all of it contributed to a fragile peace. But Elise knew better than to let her guard down. Their relationship was still in recovery, and the smallest misstep could send them spiraling backward. Elise had thrown herself into the effort to reconnect with her family. She made a point to be more present with the children, to spend time with them doing simple things, helping with homework, baking cookies, and watching movies together. It wasn't grand gestures that mattered now, but these small, quiet moments where she could show them she was still there, still their mother. Mark, too, was trying. Elise could see it in the way he made an effort to spend more time at home, to engage in conversations that once felt perfunctory, but now seemed genuine. He wasn't the same man he had been before the affair, and neither was she. But they were both trying to grow from the wreckage, and there was a cautious hope in that. Still, the shadow of Lucas lingered in Elise's mind. It had been weeks since they had last spoken, but the memory of him haunted her, especially in the quiet moments when she was alone. She had tried to put him out of her mind, to focus on repairing her marriage, but there were nights when her thoughts would drift back to him. His music, his touch, the way he had made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. Elise hadn't told Mark that Lucas had tried to reach out to her again. She didn't see the point. After their brief message exchange where she told Lucas she needed to figure things out, there had been no further contact. But still, part of her feared that if Mark ever found out, it would destroy the fragile trust they were working so hard to rebuild. One afternoon, Elise received an unexpected call from Jenna, her best friend and Mark's colleague at the law firm. Jenna had been suspiciously quiet since the affair came to light, and Elise wondered if Mark had confided in her. The thought made Elise's stomach churn. "Elise?" Jenna's voice came through the phone, a touch too bright. "We haven't talked in ages. Can you meet for coffee?" Elise hesitated, her mind racing. She hadn't seen Jenna since everything fell apart, and part of her wondered if this meeting was going to be a confrontation. But she knew she couldn't avoid it forever. Jenna had been her closest friend for years, and despite the painful distance between them, Elise still valued her friendship. "Sure," Elise replied, forcing a smile into her voice. "I'd love to." They met at a small cafe in the city, one they had frequented for years, back when their conversations were lighthearted and filled with laughter. Today, the air between them was heavy with unspoken tension. Jenna arrived first, her usual confidence slightly subdued. Elise sat down across from her, and for a moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of the past few months hanging over them. "I'm glad you came," Jenna finally said, her voice softer than usual. "Me too," Elise replied, though she wasn't entirely sure if that was true. There was a long pause before Jenna spoke again. "I've been meaning to reach out, but I didn't know what to say. I know things have been hard, and I didn't want to make it worse." Elise nodded, her throat tight. "I understand. It's been a lot." Jenna stirred her coffee, her gaze dropping to the table. "Mark hasn't said much, but I know he's been struggling. I just wanted to check in on you, see how you're doing." Elise swallowed hard, guilt rising in her chest. Jenna had always been there for her, had always been someone she could confide in. And now, Elise had kept so many secrets from her. About Lucas, about the affair, about everything. "I've made a lot of mistakes," Elise said quietly, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. "But we're working on it. Mark and I, we're trying to rebuild." Jenna looked up, her expression softening. "I'm glad to hear that. You two have been through so much, and I know it's not easy, but if anyone can come back from this, it's you." Elise felt a lump form in her throat, and she blinked back tears. "Thank you, Jenna. That means more than you know." Jenna reached across the table and squeezed Elise's hand. "I'm here for you, Elise. Whatever you need, whenever you need it. I just want you to be happy." Elise nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was a step toward mending not only her marriage, but also the relationships she had neglected along the way. As summer began to fade into autumn, the fragile peace Elise and Mark had built started to feel more solid. They continued their therapy sessions, and though there were still difficult days, the progress was undeniable. Mark had started to open up more, sharing his thoughts and feelings in ways he hadn't before. Elise, too, found herself becoming more vulnerable, more honest about her emotions and her fears. One evening, as they sat on the porch after putting the kids to bed, Mark turned to her, his expression serious. "I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness," he said quietly. Elise's heart skipped a beat. Forgiveness was the one thing she had been afraid to ask for, knowing that it wasn't something Mark could offer easily. "I don't know if I'm fully there yet," Mark continued, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "But I think I'm getting closer. I don't want to carry this anger forever. I don't want it to define us." Elise felt tears welling in her eyes. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected that Mark would be ready to even consider forgiveness. But hearing him say it, even cautiously, filled her with a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. "I don't deserve it," she whispered, her voice shaking. "But I'll spend the rest of my life earning it, Mark. I'll never stop trying." Mark turned to her, his expression softening. "I know you won't, and that's why I think maybe we can make this work. Maybe we can find our way back to each other." Elise reached for his hand, her heart full of gratitude and love. "I believe that too." They sat there in the quiet, hand in hand, watching as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. The road ahead was still long, still uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Elise believed they might just make it to the other side. But as the days passed, Elise couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Lucas had been silent since their last exchange, and while she had been relieved at first, the lack of closure gnawed at her. She had loved him, even if that love had been built on lies and secrets. He had been a part of her life for so long, and now he was simply gone. One evening, while Mark was out with the kids, Elise sat down at her desk and opened her laptop. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, before typing Lucas's name into the search bar. It was a reckless move, she knew that, but she needed to know how he was, if he had moved on, if he was okay. The search results came up quickly, and Elise scrolled through them, her heart pounding. There wasn't much, just a few mentions of his music, a small article about an upcoming performance he was giving at a local concert hall. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the date, tomorrow night. Without thinking, Elise clicked on the link to the concert hall's website, her eyes scanning the page. It was a small performance, nothing flashy, but she knew it would mean the world to Lucas. This was what he had always wanted, to share his music with the world. Elise sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She knew she shouldn't go. Seeing Lucas again would only complicate things, would risk everything she had worked so hard to rebuild. But a part of her, perhaps the same part that had been drawn to him in the first place, couldn't let go. As she closed her laptop, Elise made a decision. Tomorrow night, she would go to the concert. She needed to see him one last time to close this chapter of her life for good. The next day, Elise moved through her routine with an undercurrent of anxiety, her mind consumed by the decision she had made. She knew how reckless it was, how dangerous it could be to reopen the door to Lucas, but something inside her needed closure. Without it, she couldn't fully commit to the life she was trying to rebuild with Mark. She needed to see Lucas one last time, to say goodbye in a way that felt final. That evening, after dinner, Elise told Mark that she had to work late. It was a half-truth, and the guilt of lying to him weighed heavily on her. But she had to see this through. As she left the house, the sky was already dark, and the air had taken on the crisp chill of early autumn. Elise wrapped her coat tighter around herself as she made her way to the concert hall, her heart pounding in her chest. The hall was small, intimate, the kind of venue where every note played could be felt deep in your soul. As she walked inside, Elise felt the weight of her decision settle over her. This wasn't just about hearing Lucas play. It was about facing the person she had been when she was with him. The woman who had made choices she wasn't proud of, but who had, in a way, rediscovered herself through him. She found a seat near the back, keeping her head low. The audience was small, just a few dozen people scattered throughout the rows of seats. The lights dimmed, and the air grew still with anticipation. And then, Lucas walked onto the stage. Elise's breath caught in her throat. He looked different, older somehow, though it had only been a few months. His once messy, youthful appearance had matured, and there was a quiet confidence about him now. But his eyes, those eyes that had once held so much intensity when they looked at her, seemed more distant, more guarded. Lucas sat at the piano, his fingers hovering above the keys for a moment before he began to play. The music that filled the room was haunting, beautiful, and filled with an emotion that tugged at Elise's heart. It was as if Lucas was pouring everything he had into each note, every chord telling a story of longing, regret, and perhaps acceptance. As she listened, tears welled in Elise's eyes. She had always loved the way Lucas played, the way his music could make her feel things she hadn't been able to articulate. But tonight, the music felt different. It wasn't just for her. It was for everyone in the room, for himself. It was as if he had found a way to channel his pain into something transcendent. The piece ended, and the audience erupted into applause, but Elise couldn't move. Her hands stayed clenched in her lap, her mind spinning with emotion. As the applause died down and Lucas stood to take his bow, their eyes met for the briefest of moments. Elise's heart stopped. There was a flicker of recognition in his gaze, but also something else, something final. She stood slowly, her legs shaky, and made her way toward the exit. She didn't need to speak to him. She didn't need to hear his voice or explain herself. The music had said everything that needed to be said. It was over, and she knew that now. As Elise stepped outside into the cool night air, she took a deep breath, her chest feeling both heavy and light at the same time. She had said her silent goodbye to Lucas, and now, for the first time, she felt free. Free from the pull of the past, free to move forward with her life. The next morning, Elise woke up with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in months. She made breakfast for the children, kissed them goodbye as they left for school, and sat down at the kitchen table with Mark. "We need to talk," she said softly. Mark looked up from his newspaper, his expression wary. "What's going on?" Elise took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I went to see Lucas last night." Mark's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "Why?" His voice was low, filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. "I needed closure," Elise said quietly, her eyes meeting his. "I needed to see him, to understand that part of my life so I could let it go. And I did, Mark. I let him go." Mark stared at her for a long moment, the tension between them thick enough to cut through. Finally, he set down his newspaper, leaning forward slightly. "Did you talk to him?" "No," Elise said, shaking her head. "I didn't need to. He played, and I realized that it was over. That part of my life is over. I'm here with you because I want to be. I needed to see him one last time to be sure, and now I am." Mark ran a hand through his hair, his expression conflicted. "And you think this is it? That you can just move on now?" Elise nodded, her voice steady. "Yes, I know I've made mistakes, and I know it's going to take time to rebuild what we had. But I'm committed to this. To us." Mark sat back in his chair, letting out a long breath. "I don't know if I'll ever understand why you did what you did. But I believe you, Elise. I believe that you want to make this work." Tears filled Elise's eyes, and she reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "I do, Mark. I love you. I've always loved you, even when I lost sight of that." Mark's hand tightened around hers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a sense of hope between them. Real hope. They weren't healed, not completely, but they were moving forward, one step at a time. That evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset, Elise felt a peace settle over her. The past few months had been some of the hardest of her life, but through the pain and heartache, she had found a way to move forward. She had faced her mistakes, her fears, and her guilt, and now she was ready to rebuild her life, this time with a foundation of honesty and love. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon, Mark turned to her, his expression soft. "Do you think we'll be okay?" he asked, his voice quiet. Elise leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I think we will," she whispered, "one step at a time." And as they sat there, the world around them growing dark, Elise knew that they would be okay. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be more challenges ahead, but they were facing them together. And that, she realized, was all that mattered. Autumn settled over the city, the leaves turning shades of red and gold, and with it came a sense of renewal. Elise could feel the change in the air, both outside and within herself. The past few months had been a whirlwind of emotions, a roller coaster of heartache, regret, and healing. But now, as she looked at the life she and Mark were slowly rebuilding, there was a quiet strength in her heart. They were far from perfect, but they were still standing, and that was something to hold on to. The kids, too, had begun to adjust. They seemed lighter, happier, no longer walking on eggshells around their parents. There were still occasional moments of tension, but they were fleeting, and the laughter that had once filled their home was returning. Elise knew that the impact of her choices would linger, but she was determined to give her children the stability they deserved. One Saturday morning, as the family gathered around the breakfast table, the air was filled with the familiar scent of pancakes and fresh coffee. The kids were chatting excitedly about an upcoming school event, and Mark was flipping pancakes at the stove, his expression relaxed. It was a scene that would have been impossible just a few months ago, and Elise found herself smiling at the simple beauty of it. After breakfast, while the children ran off to play in the backyard, Elise and Mark sat together on the porch, sipping their coffee. The early morning sun cast a soft glow over the yard, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. "I've been thinking," Mark said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Elise raised an eyebrow, her heart skipping a beat. "About what?" Mark set his coffee cup down, turning to face her. "About us. About the future." Elise's chest tightened. She had learned to tread carefully in conversations like this, never sure if they would open old wounds or lead to new progress. "What about the future?" Mark paused, his gaze thoughtful. "I know we've been through a lot, more than most couples would ever have to face, and I know we still have work to do. But I don't want to live in the past anymore. I don't want what happened to define us. Elise nodded, her heart softening at his words. I don't either. Mark reached for her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. I want us to start over, a fresh start, not just in our marriage, but in everything. I've been thinking about taking a step back at work, spending more time with the kids, with you. Maybe we can travel, do the things we always said we'd do but never made time for. Elise's heart swelled with emotion. The idea of a fresh start was something she had longed for, but hadn't dared to hope for. I'd love that, she said softly. I'd love to start over with you. Mark smiled, and for the first time in a long time, it was a smile that reached his eyes. Then let's do it. Let's figure out what our new life looks like. Over the next few weeks, Mark began to make good on his promise. He cut back his hours at the law firm, something Elise had never imagined he would do. He started coming home earlier, joining Elise and the kids for family dinners and weekend outings. The change was subtle at first, but it brought a sense of balance and calm to their lives. Elise, too, made changes. She had always been a workaholic, using her career as a way to define herself. But now she found herself reevaluating what truly mattered. She took a step back from her responsibilities at work, focusing instead on the things that brought her joy, her family, her friends, and even herself. She started painting again, something she hadn't done since college, finding solace in the creative process. Their weekends were spent exploring the city, visiting museums, hiking in the nearby mountains, and rediscovering the joy of simply being together. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was real. And that was enough. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Mark turned to Elise with a contemplative look on his face. Do you ever think about what happened? He asked softly. Elise hesitated, knowing exactly what he meant. Sometimes, she admitted, but not in the same way I used to. Mark nodded, his gaze thoughtful. Me too. I used to think about it all the time. It consumed me, the anger, the hurt. But now, I don't know. I feel like we've moved past it, like it's part of our story, but not the whole story. Elise smiled, grateful for his words. I think that's exactly it. It's part of us, but it doesn't have to define us anymore. Mark reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. I'm glad we didn't give up. Me too, Elise whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence, the night air cool and crisp around them. The stars twinkled above, distant and constant, a reminder of the vastness of the world beyond their own. For the first time in a long time, Elise felt a sense of peace, a true, lasting peace that came from knowing that she and Mark had survived the storm and come out stronger on the other side. Months passed, and the new rhythm of their lives began to feel natural. Mark's decision to cut back at work had allowed them to spend more time together as a family, and the therapy sessions, though difficult at times, had helped them confront the deeper issues in their marriage. There were still moments of tension, still days when the past resurfaced, but those moments were becoming less frequent. One afternoon, as Elise sat in the backyard watching the children play, she realized how far they had come. The woman she had been when this all started, the one who had felt trapped, disconnected, and lost, was no longer the woman she saw in the mirror. She had grown, changed, and found a new sense of purpose. And for the first time in years, she felt truly at home in her own life. Mark walked out onto the porch, a smile on his face as he watched their children laughing and chasing each other through the yard. He came over to Elise, sitting beside her and wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Look at them, he said, his voice full of quiet joy. They're so happy. Elise nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. They are, and so are we. Mark turned to her, his eyes filled with a warmth that took her breath away. We did it, didn't we? We made it through. Elise smiled, her heart full. Yes, we did. They sat there in the fading light, watching their children play, their hearts light with the knowledge that they had rebuilt their lives, not perfectly, but honestly, and with love. And that was more than enough. As the sun set behind the trees, casting a warm glow over the yard, Elise knew that this was their new beginning. A new chapter in a story that had seen its share of heartache, but one that was now filled with hope, forgiveness, and the promise of a future they would write together. The end.